did have the answer down.
What do you mean? What do you mean partial credit if you got it wrong? It was a binary question. I didn't.
But I still knew the kernel.
You didn't know the answer.
Well,
that's like saying you should get credit in a math class because the correct answer was 7 and you knew that 7 existed.
No, it's like.
But you wrote 4.
There's two possible roots to the equation, and I would.
You could have multiple answers on there though, because technically Windows XP was on the opposite side of 2000, but Windows NT was the predecessor. But both of them were followed 2000.
What do you mean? There's technically 2 answers.
You said which? Maybe I'm remembering the question wrong.
Question was, what was the operating system associated with Windows 2000?
Yeah, there's 2 operating systems associated with Windows 2000.
No, 1 operating system.
Okay, well, no, I put down the right one, but wouldn't Windows XP technically be?
Windows XP is not an operating system. Windows XP is a distribution.
Oh, you're talking NT kernel. Oh, okay, which is what I put. Never mind.
Yep.
I thought you were talking.
Windows NT ran on the NT. Windows NT4 ran on the NT kernel. Windows 2000 ran on the NT kernel. Windows XP ran on the NT kernel. Windows 7 ran on the NT kernel. Windows Vista ran on the NT kernel. Windows 8 runs on the NT kernel, and Windows 10 runs on the NT kernel.
How can we have a paper due on Monday when it's Labor Day?
That doesn't mean you can't have something due.
All right then.
I'll change it to Wednesday.
Yes.
Well, my MO should typically be that I act like a jerk, but I'm fairly reasonable, right? At the end of the day, I give you very hard stuff. Although I really do have a goal of making most of the class cry at 470. It's going to be so good.
Most of us will. Don't worry.
If I cry early in class, they're going to get passed for the rest of the year.
Did you guys see the picture that Curcio put up in the middle of programming languages the other day? You just photoshopped the devil on my, which is actually an insult because I was hoping to be harder than that.
Well,
I gave a quiz in there yesterday. Nobody got it right.
You still have a cat, remember?
Type 2.
Yeah, remember what happened to the third one?
All right, so let's keep going through. So the correct answer to the quiz was the NT kernel. So the actual operating system is the kernel, right? So we have 2 kernels, 2.5 kernels we're dealing with here in our discussion. The first kernel was DOS, and then they kind of rebranded that the 9X kernel after Windows 95 came out, but same thing. Let's just say, obviously evolved. But if you go back into the DOS days, you had DOS 1, DOS 2, DOS 3. Then you started getting into DOS. And this is where Microsoft really started gouging for money. This is really funny, and we just kept doing it. So we had DOS 6, and then they had DOS 6.02. $50. Legitimately, give us $50 more for the .02 upgrade. And we did it. And then they had DOS 6.22. I think that was the end of the 6s. Then they had DOS 7. And DOS 7 was actually the last released DOS, because that's when they rolled it into the 9X kernel and renamed it inside the operating system as just the command prompt. That really. Now, okay, so interesting related question. So we're most of you, I assume, were running Windows XP or newer, correct? I think Nate told me you're still running XP on one of your machines, right? And we talked last time about some of these netbooks still have XP on them for performance reasons. XP, great operating system, but doesn't take up the system resources that 7 or 8 or 10 does, right? Is there a story behind why Windows skipped 9? Figured 8 was a big enough disappointment that they just, let's not keep the numbers too close?
Maybe it was Windows 8.1 they counted as that.
Well, the doctor has something.
What I read, I don't know how true this is, but a lot of programmers would just to check for compatibility would say check the string Windows 9 to check Windows 95, Windows 98.
That actually makes some pretty good sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Remind me about that. If you ever need extra credit, I'll give you a point.
So they didn't want to confuse it with 95, 98.
Yeah.
Because they're checking for 9 anything strings for just regular expressions, comparing the string for anything that starts with a 9. 95, 96, 95, 98.
Weren't they toying around with the name Windows Blue for a while?
Windows Blue?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose that would still be better than El Capitan.
What is Mac OS's number designation right now?
10 point, was it 10.8 is the new one?
I'm guessing that's another reason marketing.
Yeah, we're on 10.10.5 right now.
Yeah, 10. Okay, so yeah, so 0.5 is the release update of Yosemite. So this is OS X 10. The next one, El Capitan, would be 10.11. Before that, they had OS 6, OS 7, OS 8, then OS 9, and then they went to the OS X thing, and they started doing all the cats. But even within the cats, they still had 10.1, 10.2, 10.3 was what was under the hood. Okay. So in any case, yours says 0.6.
No, our Macs, they're the same. Specs.
What?
No, I said our Macs are the same in specs. Oh wait, never mind. Mine's 2 years newer. I read it wrong.
Yeah. So if yours is 2 years newer and mine's the same specs,
Oh, they're different. Very different.
what's your gigahertz?
2.2 gigahertz quad cores.
Disappointing. What was I talking about?
Dual core?
Huh?
Isn't that 2012 one a dual core?
i7's always a quad core, but it's the fake quad core.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we talked about kind of the lineage of our operating systems, 95, NT, blah, blah, blah. All these guys were the 9X kernel until we finally merged them together after Windows ME killed off the consumer line of Microsoft operating systems. So that's when we get into Windows XP, which is our first NT kernel-based operating system. So we had the stability of their business side with the compatibility with drivers and stuff like that of their consumer side. Okay, so we could argue that Windows XP was Microsoft's best operating system since '95, certainly. These are evolutionary jumps. So Windows 3.1, big evolutionary jump. We talked about that a little bit last time, how that was released kind of in line with when Apple was releasing their Macintosh operating system. So that was, a big leap when we went from kind of text-based operating systems to graphical user interface-based operating systems. 95 introduced our modern interface that everybody bases theirs off of, right? Even the Mac OS bases theirs off of this. Now, what I find interesting, and let's just kind of poll you guys about this, is we've heard Apple people reference how easy to use the Mac OS is and how it just works and so much more user-friendly and stuff. We've heard that, right? We've all heard that rhetoric, okay? My feeling is if you've never used the Mac OS before, it's not that easy to use. I mean, with Windows, you have a button that says Start. Well, where do I start? Well, let's start by clicking on Start, right? That's kind of where everything starts from. So Mac, you have the thing on the bottom, and maybe through some trial and error, you could figure out, oh, that's where I click on stuff, but only the stuff that's on the magical bar, right? What about the other stuff that didn't fit on the magical bar? Where do I go find that? Okay. Well, now you got to go and look in like the hard drive and stuff. But by default, I mean, I do it on mine, so I have my hard drive out here. But by default, that's not there. Under your Finder preferences, you have to go and click that on to show hard disks. All these things are off by default. So you're sitting here with just like this empty thing, like, oh my gosh, and we're not used to clicking on menus to show new windows, right? I mean, that's not like a common go-to move for operating system users, is it? It just seems very, very funny that Apple people would promote their operating system is very stable. I like the operating system, but I don't necessarily know if it's that like newbie friendly.
I wonder if that spawned more from their mobile OS.
Well, this came out way before the mobile OS.
Well, no, I meant that saying, though, because I've heard it more in association with Apple's mobile OS over Android.
Oh, I've heard Apple people talking about how their stuff is great and everybody else's sucks for years.
Okay.
Just years. Even back, like, with OS 8, OS 9, where when we talk, I can kind of introduce this now. It's from. Oh, by the way, after class, I need your volunteer services again for. I need to borrow a jump drive that you can take, and I don't know what you're going to do with it, but
Okay, sounds good.
related to this class.
Okay. Everyone keep an eye on Slack.
So, in any case, we're kind of looking at an overview of operating systems here, and one of the things we're going to look at, and we kind of saw right here with Windows 95, is we got multitasking from this, right? This is our first introduction of multitasking. Well, when we get into some of the deeper details of multitasking, we're going to see that multitasking comes in a couple of different flavors. Okay, we have what's called preemptive multitasking, i.e. the crappy Apple, the old school Apple multitasking, and then traditional multitasking, what we call traditional multitasking now. So in the early days of the Mac operating system, so let's kind of jump over here to a second slide here of history of Apple OS. Apple OS. Okay, well, we're just not typing today. It's invisible ink.
Did you bring the Kool-Aid so we can always drink?
I'll drink the Kool-Aid.
It's just white font.
It's not?
No, it doesn't seem like it's typing. No,
Yeah, it's common. I thought I could just close the presentation. I had to close Keynote. It'll be fine now.
It's a Mac thing.
Very appropriate given our line of discussion right now.
It's really yeah.
Hey, nothing crashed. Nothing crashed. Well, yeah, the this works thing. That's all right. So this is Mac OS's. What just happened?
What's going on?
It just works, huh?
Boom, nailed it. All right, so Mac OS's. So the first Mac OS, well, really, we probably should say Apple OS's. So first Mac OS was DOS. This was when Apple and Microsoft were still friends and that stuff. So, this is really, we talk about the genius of Microsoft. We talked about this last time with their deal with IBM. Microsoft, we did talk about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I mean, Microsoft was going around and I think at the time when they partnered with Apple, they did actually have an operating system. Ooh, 1 minute apart. Just works. iCloud getting confused from all the opening and closing.
And slides go.
Slides gone. All right. So in any case, I think at the time that Microsoft and Apple partnered, Microsoft actually had the operating system, so it wasn't as deceitful at that point. But in any case, DOS was the first operating system that the Apple computers had running on it. Okay. They did use a different file system format, though. So even back then, even though, even back then when there were two competing operating systems both running the same stuff, they still weren't file system compatible. We'll talk about file systems, but we've seen this. If I have a Macintosh formatted jump drive, let's say, and we put it into one of the machines here that are PCs, you won't be able to read it. But if we have a FAT32 formatted jump drive, all of our machines would see it. Okay, but what's the downside of a FAT32 jump drive? Yeah, 4 gigabytes maximum single file size. That problem is not a problem with the NT file system. So NT file system doesn't have that issue. But if you format your PC jump drive with NT, it'll work on your PCs, all the PCs in here. But if I put it in my Mac, it won't work. Mac doesn't know about NT. Okay, and even there is NT support like on Linux, but it's experimental. And part of that's because Microsoft's stuff is proprietary, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they invented the NT file system, and they kept it close. They have some security stuff built into it. They don't want other people being able to copy it. Makes perfect sense, right? So the reason that the reason that when you buy a USB hard drive or you buy a jump drive or something like that, that it comes pre-formatted FAT32, so it doesn't matter what machine you plug it into, which is very interesting. Because one of the things so actually, who here besides Nick works at Best Buy? We're going to test Best Buy employee knowledge. Well, I guess it's on you then.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm a customer comes into Best Buy and I'm looking at your external USB hard drives, and I see these couple of hard drives that say Mac compatible, and they're $20 more. Do I need that for my Mac, or can I use one of the other ones?
You can gladly use one of the other ones if you know how to format it.
Okay.
But it's super easy to on a Mac in general. All you have to do is go to Disk Utility from Spotlight.
Okay. How confident are you in your answer?
You just have to reformat it on most of them. So about 70% of the ones we carry, I'd say, are able to be reformatted. But if they are formatted with an NT, then you're kind of...
I don't actually think they come Mac formatted. They come FAT32 formatted.
So you got to...
They come FAT32 formatted. The real difference is that most of the Mac ones have a now they have a Thunderbolt port, but before they had a FireWire port. So it had to do with the interfaces on the back of them. And actually, if you go into Best Buy and you look at like the Western Digital line of external hard drives, you know how like they have like the Home and the Pro and the Nightmare Magician one, whatever it is. They have like the various price points, right? You know, what's the difference between those? It's the number of ways you can plug it in. Right, you have eSATA, which is going to be your fastest outside of Thunderbolt, but then USB 3 for some of them, FireWire, which doesn't really exist anymore, but was a thing. So that's the real difference. So you never always buy the cheapest one, unless you have a very specific interface need. If you want it to work on USB 3, make sure you look for USB 3 and not you don't buy the USB 2 one for $15 less because it's going to be half the speed. That kind of stuff. But you know, in any case,
Make one with the solid state.
this kind of falls into the category of you didn't deactivate editing mode.
I think your computer is a little possessed.
Just works, people.
Hey,
Hey, I was going to say that. Trust me. It is kind of creepy.
Yeah, really.
I think it's haunted.
Aside from the period, it's got pretty good grade.
That's
Is there an editing mode in Keynote?
I have no idea. That just reminded me this morning. My wife sent me a picture of my cat Gracie in possessed mode. There's my cat in possessed mode.
He even scooted away.
So. All right, you didn't deactivate editing mode. Perfect. Okay, shut up. So in any case, there's been a war going on between these two companies for a long time, and they make things as inconvenient as they possibly can. I just figured out what the problem is. Okay, raise your hand if you're the one screwing with me.
Somebody log in to keep
No,
this
it's
deal.
when I did the sharing, it must have defaulted to editing, which is why they said that. So let's go ahead and do that.
Didn't you learn last year when I put a goat on
Well,
the slide?
first of all, this is really a weakness of Apple. Because what I did earlier today is I went to sharing, and I said share via iCloud and just did copy link. So you would assume the default would be not to allow the whole world to edit it, right?
Apparently not.
Yeah, apparently not. So.
You have literally not proved anything good about Apple yet.
Well, I started off ripping on them, so let's just be fair here. All right. So in any case, Microsoft, Apple shared the same OS for a while, but still had different file systems. That was a problem, that kind of stuff. But in any case, once Apple transitioned to their Macintosh line, so internally at Apple they had two separate operating systems or two separate product lines. They had the Apple product line, and then they had the Macintosh product line that they were working on internally. Interestingly enough, there's a documentary. I haven't watched it yet, so I can't necessarily comment on it. I'm going to watch it tonight. Just got released today. It's on iTunes and Amazon Prime, I think, and it might be in some theaters. But it's called Steve Jobs, The Man in the Machine, or something like that. It's like a 2-hour documentary. from what I've seen of it, it looks like it's a pretty interesting representation of him. I think I've mentioned it before. The guy obviously was a genius, changed the world, blah blah blah. But I mean, was kind of a lunatic and really worked people to their breaking point and that kind of stuff. So interesting to look at the difference between what he did and who the man was himself. And obviously he's kicked the bucket at this point, but it's still interesting to go back and not so much to demonize him, but to look at maybe almost what it took to get people to believe that they could do those changes. And I'm not sure it's the right way, but it was a way because it did ultimately work, right? Okay, so in any case, we have DOS. Once we transitioned away from that, Apple had rebranded what was the Xerox Star operating system to just what they called the Mac OS. All right. I think I mentioned this. Do I mention the Xerox Star here last time?
Mm-hmm.
Briefly? Okay. So Bob and I probably said something along the lines that Xerox decided that the real money was in copy machines. Okay, so that was the punchline. This was back in the very, very early days of personal computers when they hadn't necessarily taken off. We didn't know how popular computers were going to be or how popular the internet is or was going to be when these things first started. And hindsight's always 20/20, right? Okay, so Xerox decided, hey, we've been making pretty good money off copy machines. We dabbled in this personal computer stuff, but it was an internal project that we were working on. We thought this whole mouse-based graphical user interface thing was kind of a good idea. But, we put too much resources and stuff like that, and, we want to start focusing on, like, color copiers, maybe. So we're gonna put this project on the back burner and move on. And one of the guys from Xerox was buddies with Steve Jobs, so invited him in and says, hey, we've already worked on this, we're abandoning it. Maybe you guys can do something with it. So Apple came in, took it, they did their thing, released it under the Mac OS. I can't really comment on how many changes they made to it. Probably a reasonable amount of changes, but at the core, it was still somebody else's operating system, which isn't a problem. Why reinvent the wheel, right? So they released the Mac OS, so really had, Mac, in terms of the ones that were popular. So we had Mac OS 6, then Mac OS 7, then Mac OS 8, then Mac OS 9. Very, very imaginative operating system names by Apple. All right. Now, what's funny is, I was mentioning about the multitasking model a few minutes ago, and all of these Macintosh operating systems had a multitasking model known as Pre-Emptive Multitasking, and we'll talk about that in more detail later in terms of how that actually works when we talk about how multitasking is actually implemented. But at least at the high level, the way Pre-Emptive Multitasking works is whatever task you currently have in the forefront that you're currently working with on your computer, that's the one that's getting 99.9% of the CPU power. The stuff that's in the background is given enough CPU power to remain alive. That's it. All right. So from a user's perspective, if we're flipping back and forth between applications, it seems ideal that the application that we're currently working with is getting all the CPU power, so it'll be operating the fastest. And other things are there so that they're alive, so I can quick flip to them. And once it becomes the foreground, now it's getting CPU power. So on the surface, that seems like a reasonable model, right? Why might that not be a reasonable model by our standards today? Think about the way you use your computers today. What are some things that would break down there?
Well, so we have iTunes and stuff, and sometimes we want downloads in the background.
Yeah.
That requires some CPU.
Yeah, so we don't just put our applications in the background. We rely on our applications to do some crap in the background, whether it's stream music or download a file. So imagine you were downloading, well, back then a big file might be a 3 megabyte file. Okay, huge file, 3 megabytes. And you put that in the background, and let's say it's going to take an hour to download that file. Okay, pretty decent internet back then. You put it in the background, you started working on your paper or whatever, and You go and check on it. You notice that the download speed has moved to like 0.01 bits per second. All right. Just enough to keep it alive. It's barely made any progress and it's been sitting there for a week. Okay, a couple hours, whatever it is. So a problem with preemptive multitasking, right? Now, the issue here is when preemptive multitasking first came out, probably wasn't really a problem. We didn't have applications that had stuff to do in the background. They were pretty much, when we were interacting with them, we're doing stuff. Otherwise, we just want to have to not launch the thing from scratch again because it takes applications some time to launch, especially on machines back then. So preemptive multitasking started becoming a problem. Now, the issue here is that Apple, we look at Apple today and we kind of view them as kind of good software engineers and stuff like that, and they write their own software and they make their own hardware and everything's really cool and the stuff is pretty good and all this stuff. Well, back then they were using somebody else's operating system. And they had made some changes to it, but the core components of the operating system, how multitasking works, memory management, things like that, the actual core components, they didn't really have a whole lot to do with when they acquired the code base. So it was not easy for them to go and make those changes. So they didn't view it as a problem. All right? So OS 6, OS 7, OS 8, OS 9 all had preemptive multitasking. Now what's really funny about this is all during the time when people, especially the Apple people, okay, they would make fun of the Windows people with the blue screen of death, right? I'll flip that around on Apple and I'll say, at least the Microsoft operating system lets you know when your computer crashed, right? Because you got the blue screen of death. Clearly something bad has occurred, right? On a Mac, you would, one of my hobbies used to be, I had a couple Linux machines and I had a Mac. This is back when they still ran PowerPC processors. And my main machine was a PC. And I always liked kind of writing my own drivers for like sharing network resources and printers and stuff like that to map stuff to the Windows version of the printer so that your Mac could talk to Windows stuff. It was kind of an interesting geeky hobby, I guess. But Windows, when it crashes, you get the blue screen of death. You know something bad has happened. Well, it was fairly often I'd turn on the Mac, turn on the screen in the morning, let's say, and I'd leave the machine would be on, and everything would look fine. In fact, the mouse even worked. The mouse would move on the screen. Then you kind of notice in the upper right-hand corner when you look at the clock, it's like 2:13 a.m. or something like that. It's not 2:13 a.m. It's like 8 a.m., 9 a.m., something like that. That was the time that it crashed. It was letting you know its moment of death. Mouse still worked. Nothing else functioned. You even could move the mouse around. Couldn't click, couldn't do anything. Had to hard power off the machine in order to get it to reboot. And those folks were the ones demonizing Windows for the blue screen of death. Can't we just say that they all crashed? They all had bugs. They all had problems. Although the Mac crashed more elegantly. We preserved the body until you came in and had to officially off it.
Didn't crash. You shut it down.
And then sometimes you'd have the Mac. You had the little Mac sad face.
Oh God.
Have you seen these?
I remember that.
The Mac sad face logo. Oh, we gotta look at that.
Oh, I remember that. Same with my school.
Mac sad face logo. Yeah, look at these. Oh. Yeah, so just right. This is the color screen. So look, you even had a little tear. Just a little tear. So something bad would happen, and you have a white screen with that picture in the middle.
Can you make that face again?
Now, what's actually funny, years ago, before I think, Nick's a little older, so possibly, how old are you?
38.
38, okay, not before he was born, okay? But most of the rest of you, before you were born, I had an Epson computer. Okay? An Epson computer. The Epson doesn't make computers anymore. Okay, so I had an Epson computer, and it was like, I don't know, the 286, actually it might have been an x86, an S86, I don't know, 5 megahertz or something like that. computer. And the day it died, I was actually very impressed. I'm sitting at the computer, and it actually made a sound like a bomb was dropping. And then it made the... And then a little bomb showed up in the middle of the screen and was flashing. It was all black and white thing. That computer never worked again. And all I can think is this was like the predecessor to like hackers or something like that, right? Okay, so this was some engineer at Epson who like put some Easter egg into the BIOS of this computer that said after boot number whatever, this was like right before he quit his job, put the bomb sound and never let the BIOS load again.
That's when the black screen appears and the Neo comes up on the screen all the way back.
Yeah. Completely true story. Completely true story. So, yeah, very, very funny. All right. So, in any case, so we had Mac OS 9, and, at the time, the Apple user base, the non-technical Apple user base, let's use that as the main example, was using rhetoric about how much better they are than anybody else. Okay? I would say the technical Apple user base, the folks that were still drinking the Kool-Aid but kind of knew what was really going on, they pretty much just kept their mouths shut. Okay, they wouldn't really say the truth, but they wouldn't really demonize the other guy because, whatever. Well, this was around the same, kind of right in here is when Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple. All right, he was fired from his own company. We talked about that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So so in any case, he was kicked out of Apple, went and found Next Computers, was brought back in, and then we got the OS X. So this is Mac OS X. So the question was, is this 10 or
Next computer.
the X in Unix? Okay, the X in Unix. What does the X stand for? Is it 10 or the X in Unix? Because Mac OS X was based on OpenBSD, which is a Unix operating system, which was great for the future of the Mac OS, terrible for the modern Mac OS. Because you had all these people, all these fanboys that had a whole bunch of software that ran on Mac OS 9, Mac OS 8, so on and so forth, and none of it ran on Mac OS X. Because Mac OS X is based on an entirely different architecture. They're just not compatible. Okay? Back in this day, Mac OS X, actually let me kick it down 2 lines here, was still running on PowerPC processors. All right, so, this wasn't necessarily that long ago, a decade ago, something like that. Decade ago, Macs they did not run on Intel processors. They ran on PowerPC processors, which were made by IBM. These were reduced instruction set processors. So let's talk about what that means here. RISC processors. Okay, reduced instruction set. Now, we talk about CPUs, and I've kind of advertised CPUs as being this big collection of magic tricks, right? All right, but these magic tricks need to be granular enough to solve little tiny bits of a problem. And then we string them together to solve more complex problems. So the idea is that we need to have a magic trick do enough that is useful, but not do too much that it does more than we need it to do sometimes and have to roll backwards, or even not be able to get to a state that we want to be in. If you need to have 3 blocks sitting next to each other and all you have is 2 block chunks, you can't get to 3 blocks. There's no undoing that, right? Okay, so we need to have the instruction set be granular enough that we can solve all the problems, but not too granular that it's unwieldy, so on and so forth. Well, the idea of reduced instruction set processors was we're going to have less magic tricks, but still be able to accomplish the same stuff. So use this little example, where, like I just said, we need them to be granular enough. Well, the reduced instruction set processor said, well, these are granular enough. They're just less, or they're just more, less granular? They're just less granular than these guys over here. Each instruction on a reduced instruction set processor accomplishes more than the equivalent instructions do on a, might take 2 or 3 instructions on an Intel processor, let's say. So at first this sounds like a good idea because, less instructions means less things to remember, right? Which also means that our processors then become a little simpler. Well, that was to the layman. Processors become simpler. What do you think is the biggest reason today that our processors aren't 10 times faster than they are?
Physical limitations.
Okay, like what?
You're working in physical space. You can't. We were talking about it last time with
How many transistors we can fit on there?
yeah.
Yeah, certainly physical limitations do play a role, but that's not our limiting factor right now. We can fit more transistors on a chip than we do.
Could it be the heat?
100%. 100%. The reason that we can't make stuff faster right now is heat. It's always been the enemy, heat. All right, so if you've ever built your own computer and the fan dies on it and you're not aware of it, that's why computers have a lot of sensors on them now that know what the speed of the chip, what the heat of the chip is, and will turn the machine off if it gets beyond a point. If you run a CPU without a fan and can convince the motherboard to do it, that CPU's toast real quick. And they get very hot and you have to dissipate. You got a story?
Actually, yeah. I was building my latest computer, and it's a mini ITX board, and I was having all kinds of problems with the processor and the motherboard and stuff, and none of it was working. But I finally figured out that the processor was having problems, so we decided to try it without the fan on it and see if it would actually run. Well, we didn't cause any problems, but it ran for about 2 seconds before it shut everything down.
Mm-hmm.
You could smell something.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was.
Yeah, it gets hot.
Yeah, but it worked after. So
Sure. Yeah. But it wouldn't had it not shut off.
Right. No. Yeah.
I think I've told this story in some of my other classes. Some of you have probably heard it before. That I had a buddy when I was in the dorms, and he had a Celeron, really old school. It was a 600. It was a 200 megahertz Intel Celeron processor. He had overclocked to like 1.1 gigahertz. This is back when gigahertz weren't a thing. Okay. And the guy had his case open with like fans pointed in there, and in the middle of the night he comes banging on my door. His entire room is engulfed in flames. Not like a little fire. His dorm room is ablaze. Right? Gutted, completely gone. Yeah, it was funny. Nobody was hurt, but until we found out we had to share the cost of that repair. But in any case, on the surface, we might say that reduced instruction sets sounds like a decent idea, right? But we need to think of what does it mean for there to be an instruction set? And when we talk about these transistors and we talk about instructions, all of it comes back to this concept, this programming skill set. Okay, we've all been exposed to writing software with code. We write lines of code and we run it and things happen. Well, physical programming we would do with logic gates, with transistors, with little tiny widgets that you string together in a whole bunch of interesting ways. You pass electricity through them, indicating your inputs, and then it spits out outputs in the other end. And if you want them to do complex things, you use more parts. Make sense? So reduced instruction sets did not necessarily mean less space, because each of those instructions now became a more complex little widget, had more little transistors and logic gates built into it for performing its task. Well, they actually had a big problem producing these. Here, let's just reduced instruction set. And this IBM was making these chips, the PowerPC chips. So they had a problem with these because it was a major heat issue. too many of their components were having to sit too close to each other because they were all part of the same program, part of the same widget that lived in there. So it was a major, major heat issue. And they couldn't produce the chips to keep up with the speeds of the Joneses across the street. The Intel chips were outpacing them by quite a bit. So finally, Apple made that transition to Intel, which was probably one of the best decisions Apple ever made for multiple reasons. First of all, they were having a lot of issues with the RISC processors. The last RISC processor they had was the G4 processor, the Macintosh G4 or the PowerPC G4 processor. Had some really cool features, did some really cool stuff, but they were having a lot of problems. I think the fastest one they made was maybe 1.4 gigahertz, something along those lines. But that was a very difficult chip for them to produce. Apparently it had something like a 70 or 80% failure rate in production. Once they produced it, the 20% that came out of production passing the test, they worked. I don't think there was a major problem with them in homes. It was expensive for them to produce them because such a high percentage of them did not come out of the mold. Okay, something like that. But in any case, reduced instruction set processors kind of went away because we had heat problems. And Apple jumped on the bandwagon with Intel, which was probably the best thing for consumers and certainly the best thing for Apple. I mean, Apple's made a lot of money since that decision. So Mac OS X, the very first one, what was the first Mac OS X called? Oh, Snow Leopard. No, not anywhere. Was it Panther? Yeah, we have to. I think it was Panther. History of Mac OS X.
Why'd you do this, Apple? I don't like cats.
Illustrated history of Mac OS X.
Just a bunch of cats running around.
AKA Fanboy 101.
Oh, look at that.
Cheetah was the first.
All right. You have to admit this is kind of interesting. All right.
Epic.
Okay, so yeah, Mac OS X Cheetah.
It started with the bear. No, it started
No,
with the bear.
go back up. It started with Kodiak. Scroll down.
No, Kodiak was the beta. That wasn't.
It started with a bear, not a cat.
Beta. Got it.
It was a public beta.
Then Puma, Jaguar. Wait a minute, what's that?
I don't know.
Panther.
Is he giving the finger?
Tiger.
No.
Was that when it made the transition to Intel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's Intel. 2005.
Oh, they really went crazy on this cast thing.
Leopard.
It looks like it's burning.
I actually really like this page. These illustrations are great. Snow leopard.
Look at the
Oh, this is a good one.
dead. Mountain lion. Mavericks. Yosemite.
Yosemite.
And now El Capitan.
Yeah, we don't have El Capitan on there. Okay. Well, so in any case, we've seen the evolution of those guys. At the very least, we can say that those were more interesting OS names than OS 8, OS 9, those things, right? Well, I mean, we have several of you in here. I think we asked last time who are Android users, right? Android names all their stuff after desserts. I mean,
marshmallows. Isn't it?
Yeah, we have Kit Kat and cotton candy and
jelly bean.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Wouldn't you rather have that than Android OS, some creepy number after it or something like that? All right. So, in any case, your first assignment is up. It is a paper. It's a 12 to 15 page paper.
Shenanigans, don't lie to me.
How was I supposed to write it? We didn't really talk about anything to do with mobile.
Have you read it? The assignment?
No,
I could write that.
yeah, I said based on the assignment is based on what we've discussed already, and based on what you know. What are the goal of an operating system is to make a user is to make it easy for us to communicate with the computer, right? But also the computer has to be functional. We talked about that through Vista, about Vista and things like that. What are the decisions? What are the things that go back and forth between a desktop operating system and a mobile operating system? What has to change? I'll give you a starting point. One runs off a battery, one's plugged into the wall. Okay, that's going to be your starting point
One
on
doesn't have a fan.
what the differences are gonna end up being. And we just talked about heat today as well. All right, I'll see everybody on Wednesday. Is that right? All right.
No, I'll see you in like 30 minutes, or 3 hours, whatever.